Living My Life, Emma Goldman, Chapter 5. When I faced the audience the next evening, my mind was blank. I could not remember a single word of my notes. I shut my eyes for an instant, then something strange happened. In a flash, I saw it. Every incident of my 3 years in Rochester, the Garson factory, its drudgery and humiliation, the failure of my marriage, the Chicago crime. The last words of August Spice rang in my ears. Our silence will speak louder than the voices you strangle today. I began to speak. Words I had never heard myself utter before came pouring forth faster and faster. They came with passionate intensity. They painted images of the heroic men of the gallows, their glowing vision of an ideal life, rich with comfort and beauty, men and women radiant in freedom, children transformed by joy and affection. The audience had vanished. The hall itself had disappeared. I was conscious only of my own words, of my ecstatic song. I stopped. Tumultuous applause rolled over me, the buzzing of voices, people telling me something I could not understand. Then I heard someone quite close to me say, "It was an inspired speech, but what about the 8 hour struggle? You've said nothing about that." I felt hurled down from my exalted heights, crushed. I told the chairman I was too tired to answer questions, and I went home feeling ill in body and mind. I let myself quietly into Helena's apartment and threw myself on the bed in my clothes. Exasperation with most for forcing the tour on me, anger with myself for having so easily succumbed to his influence, the conviction that I had cheated the audience, all seething in my mind together with a new revelation. I could sway people with words, strange and magic words that welled up from within me from some unfamiliar depth. I wept the joy of knowing. Then I went to Buffalo, determined to make another effort. The preliminaries of the meeting threw me into the same nervous tension, but when I faced the audience, there were no visions to inflame my mind. In an endless, repetitious manner, I made my speech about the waste of energy and time, the 8 hour struggle involved, scoffing at the stupidity of the workers who fought for such trifles. At the end of what seemed to me several hours, I was complimented on my clear and logical presentation. Some questions were asked, and I answered them with a sureness that brooked no gainsaying. But on my way home from the meeting, my heart was heavy. No words of exaltation had come to me, and how could one hope to reach other hearts when one's own remained cold? I decided to write Most the next morning, begging him to relieve me of the necessity of going to Cleveland. I could not bear to repeat once more the meaningless prattle. After a night's sleep, my decision seemed childish and weak. How could I give up so soon? Would Most have given up like that? Would Sasha? Well, I too would go on. I took the train for Cleveland. The meeting was large and animated. It was a Saturday night, and the workers attended with their wives and children. Everybody drank. I was surrounded by a group, offered refreshments, and asked questions. How did I happen to come into the movement? Was I German? What was I doing for a living? The petty curiosity of people supposed to be interested in the most advanced ideas reminded me of the Rochester grilling of the day of my arrival in America. It made me thoroughly angry. The gist of my talk was the same as in Buffalo. but the form was different. It was a sarcastic arraignment, not of the system or of the capitalists, but of the workers themselves, their readiness to give up a great future for some small temporary gains. The audience seemed to enjoy being handled in such an outspoken manner. They roared in some places and in others vigorously applauded. It was not a meeting, it was a circus, and I was the clown. A man in the front row who had attracted my attention by his white hair and lean, haggard face rose to speak. He said that he understood my impatience with such small demands as a few hours less a day or a few dollars more a week. It was legitimate for young people to take time lightly. But what were men of his age to do? They were not likely to live to see the ultimate overthrow of the capitalist system. Were they also to forego the release of perhaps 2 hours a day from the hated work? That was all they could hope to see realized in their lifetime. Should they deny themselves even the small achievement? Should they never have a little more time for reading or being out in the open? Why not be fair to people chained to the block? The man's earnestness, his clear analysis of the principle involved in the 8-hour struggle brought home to me the falsity of the mosque position. I realized I was committing a crime against myself and the workers by serving as a parrot, repeating Mosque's views. I understood why I had failed to reach my audience. I had taken refuge in cheap jokes and bitter thrusts against the toilers to cover up my own inner lack of conviction. My first public experience did not bring the results Mosque had hoped for, but it taught me a valuable lesson. It cured me somewhat of my childlike faith in the infallibility of my teacher and impressed on me the end of independence thinking. In New York, my friends had prepared the grand reception for me. Our flat was spotlessly clean and filled with flowers. They were eager for an account of my tour, and they felt apprehensive of the effect upon most of my changed attitude. The next evening, I went out with Most again to Terrace Garden. He had grown younger during my 2 weeks' absence. His rough beard was trimmed neatly, and he wore a natty new gray suit, a red carnation in his buttonhole. He joined me in a gay mood, presenting me with a large bouquet of violets. The 2 weeks of my absence had been unbearably long, he said, and he had reproached himself for having let me go just when we had grown so close. But now he would never again let me go, not alone anyhow. I tried several times to tell him about my trip, hurt to the quick that he had not asked about it. He had sent me forth against my will. He had been so eager to make a great speaker of me. Was he not interested to know whether I had proved an apt pupil? Yes, of course, he replied, but he had already received the reports from Rochester that I had been eloquent, from Buffalo that my presentation had silenced all opponents, and from Cleveland that I had flayed the dullards with biting sarcasm. What about my own reactions? I asked. Don't you want me to tell you about that? Yes, another time. Now he wanted only to feel me near, his blonde Kopf, his little girl woman. I flared up, declaring I would not be treated as a mere female. I blurted out that I would never again follow blindly, that I had made a fool of myself, that the 5-minute speech of the old worker had convinced me more than all his persuasive phrases. I talked on, my listener keeping very silent. When I had finished, he called the waiter and paid the bill. I followed him out. On the street, he burst out in a storm of abuse. He had reared a viper, a snake, a heartless coquette, who had played with him like a cat with a mouse. He had sent me out to plead his cause, and I had betrayed him. I was like the rest. But he would not stand for it. He would rather cut me out of his heart right now than have me as a lukewarm friend. Who is not with me is against me, he shouted. I will not have it otherwise. A great sadness overwhelmed me, as if I had just experienced an irreparable loss. Soon a new call came to me of workers on strike, and I followed it eagerly. It came from Joseph Borantes, whom I had previously met. He was of the group of young Jewish socialists and anarchists who had organized the cloakmakers and other Yiddish unions. Borantes was now at the head of the union directing the cloakmakers' strike. I threw myself into the work with all the ardor of my being, and I became absorbed in it to the exclusion of everything else. My task was to get the girls in the trade to join the strike. For that purpose, meetings, concerts, socials, and dances were organized. At these affairs, it was not difficult to press upon the girls the need of making common cause with their striking brothers. I had to speak often, and I became less and less disturbed when on the platform. My faith in the justice on the strike helped me to dramatize my talks and to carry conviction. Within a few weeks, my work brought scores of girls into the ranks of the strikers. I became live once more. At the dances, I was one of the most untiring and gayest. One evening, a cousin of Sasha, a young boy, took me aside. With a grave face, as if he were about to announce the death of a dear comrade, he whispered to me that it did not behoove an agitator to dance. Certainly not with such reckless abandon, anyway. It was undignified for one who was on the way to become a force in the anarchist movement. My frivolity would only hurt the cause, with a capital C. I grew furious at the impudent interference of the boy. I told him to mind his own business. I was tired of having the cause constantly thrown into my face. I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful ideal, for anarchism, for release of freedom from conventions and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. I insisted that our cause could not expect the denial of life and joy. I insisted that our cause could not expect me to become a nun, and that the movement should not be turned into a cloister. If it meant that I did not want it. I want freedom, the right of self-expression, everybody's right of beautiful, radiant things. Anarchism meant that to me, and I would live it in spite of the whole world, prisons, persecution, everything. Yes, even in spite of the condemnation of my own closest comrades, I would live my beautiful ideal. The strenuous weeks of the strike now gave way to less arduous activities, lectures, evenings at the netters, or at our flat, and efforts of secure employment again. Fedya had begun to work with crayons, enlarging photographs. He declared that he could not keep on wasting our money. Helen's and mine on paints. He felt he would never become a great painter anyway. I suspected it was something else. No doubt his desire to earn money so that he could relieve me of hard work. I had not been feeling very well, especially during periods on which occasions I always had to take to bed in excruciating pain for days. It had been so since my great shock when mother slapped my face. It grew worse when I caught a cold on our way to Königsberg to St. Petersburg. We had to be smuggled across the border. Mother, my two brothers, and I. I was in the latter part of it was in the latter part of 1881, and the winter was particularly severe. The smugglers had told mother that we would have to wade through deep snow, even across a half-frozen brook. Mother worried about me because I was taken sick a few days earlier than my time, owing to the excitement of our departure from Königsberg. At 5 in the morning, shivering with cold and fear, we started out. Soon we reached the brook that separated the German and Russian frontiers. The very anticipation of the icy water was paralyzing, but there was no escape. We had to plunge in or be overtaken and perhaps shot by soldiers patrolling the border. A few troubles finally induced them to turn their backs, but they had cautioned us to be quick. We plunged in, mother loaded with bundles and I carrying my little brother. The sudden chill froze my blood. Then I felt a stinging sensation in my spine, abdomen, and legs, as if I were being pierced with hot irons. I wanted to scream, but terror of the soldiers checked me. Soon we were over, and the stinging ceased, but my teeth kept chattering and I was in a hot sweat. We ran as fast as we could to the inn on the Russian side. I was given hot tea with my malini, packed in hot bricks and covered with a large feather bed. I felt feverish all the way to St. Petersburg, and the pain in my spine and legs was racking. I was laid up for weeks, and my spine remained weak for years afterwards. In America, I had consulted Solotaroff about my trouble, and he took me to a specialist who urged an operation. He seemed surprised that I could have stood my condition so long and that I had been at all able to have physical contact. My friends informed me that the physician had said I would never be free from pain or experience full sexual release unless I submitted to my operation. Solotaroff asked me whether I had ever wanted a baby, because if you have the operation, he explained, you will be able to have a child. So for your condition has made that impossible. A cruel hand clutched at my heart. My ghastly childhood stood before me, my hunger for affection which mother was unable to satisfy, father's harshness towards the children, his violent outbreaks, his beating my sister and me. Two frightful experiences were particularly fresh in my mind. Once father lashed me with the strap so that my little brother Herman, awakened by my cries, came running up and bit father on the calf. The lashing stopped. Helena took me to her room, bathed my bruised back, brought me milk, held me to her heart, her tears mingling with mine, while father outside was raging. I'll kill her. I will kill that brat. I will teach her to obey. One day I was given a low mark for bad behavior. I went home in trembling fear. I could not face father. I showed my paper to mother. She began to cry, said that I would be their ruin, that I was an ungrateful and willful child, and that she would have to let father see the paper. But she would plead with him for me, although I did not deserve it. I walked away from her with a heavy heart. At our bay window, I looked out over the fields in the distance. Children were playing there. They seemed to belong to another world. There never had been much play in my life. A strange thought came to me. How wonderful it would be if I were stricken with some consuming disease. It would surely soften Father's heart. I had never known him soft save Sukkot, the autumnal holiday of rejoicing. Father did not drink except a little on certain Jewish fetes, on this day especially. Then he would glow jolly. Father, the children gather the children about him, promise us new dresses and toys. It was the one bright spot in our lives, and we always eagerly looked forward to it. It happened only once a year, as long as I could think back. I remembered his saying that he had not wanted me. He had wanted a boy. The pig woman had cheated him. Perhaps if I should become very ill, near death, he would become kind and never beat me again, or let me stand in the corner for hours, or make me walk back and forth with a glass of water in my hand. If you spill a drop, you will get whipped, he would threaten. The whip and the little stool were always at hand. They symbolized the shame and my tragedy. After many attempts and considerable punishment, I had learned to carry the glass without spilling the water. The process used to unnerve me and make me ill for hours later. My father was handsome, dashing, and full of vitality. I loved him even while I was afraid of him. I wanted him to love me, but I never knew how to reach his heart. His hardness served only to make me more contrary. Why was he so hard? I was wondering, as I looked out the bay window, lost in recollections. Suddenly I felt terrific pain in my head, as if I had been struck with an iron bar. It was Father's first fist that had smashed the round comb I wore to hold my unruly hair. He pounded me and pulled me about, raging, "You are my disgrace. You will always be so. You can't be my child. You don't look like me or like your mother. You don't act like us." Sister Helena wrestled with him for my life. She tried to tear me away from his grip, and the blows intended for me fell upon her. At last, Father became tired, grew dizzy, and fell headlong to the floor. Helena shouted to Mother that Father had fainted. She hurried me along to her room and locked the door. All my love and longing for my father were turned to hatred. After that, I avoided him and never talked to him unless in an answer. I did what I was told mechanically. The gulf between us widened with the years. My home had become a prison. Every time I tried to escape, I was caught and put back in the chains forged by my father. From St. Petersburg to America, from Rochester to my marriage, there were repeated attempts to escape. The last and final one was before I left Rochester for New York. Mother had not been feeling well, and I went over to put her house in order. I was on the floor scrubbing while Father was nagging me for having married Kirshner, for having left him, and again for returning to him. "You are a loose character," he kept on saying. "You have always disgraced yourself in the family." He talked while I continued scrubbing. Then something snapped within me. My lone and woeful childhood, my tormented adolescence, my joyless youth. I flung them all into Father's face. He stood aghast as I denounced him, emphasizing every charge by beating my scrubbing brush on the floor. Every cruel incident of my life stood out in my arm arrangement. Our large barn of a home, father's angry voice resounding through it, his ill treatment of the servants, his iron grip on my mother, everything that had haunted my days and terrorized my nights, I now recalled in my bitterness. I told him that if I had not become the harlot he repeatedly called me, it was not his fault. I had been on the verge even of going on the street more than once. It was Helena's love and devotion that had saved me. My words rushed on like a torrent, the brush pounding the floor with all the hatred and scorn I felt for my father. The terrible scene ended with my hysterical screams. My brother carried me up and put me to bed. The next morning, I left the house. I did not see father again before I went to New York. I had learned since that my tragic childhood had been no exception, that there were thousands of children born unwanted, marred and maimed by poverty and still more by ignorant misunderstanding. No child of mine should ever be added to those unfortunate victims. There was also another reason, my growing absorption in my newfound ideal. I had determined to serve it completely. To fulfill that mission, I must remain unhampered and untied. Years of pain and of suppressed longing for a child, what were they compared with the practice many martyrs had already paid? I too would pay the price. I would endure the suffering. I would find an outlet for my mother's need in the love of all children. The operation did not take place. Several weeks' rest and the loving care of my friends of Sasha who had returned to the house, the Minkin sisters, Most, who called often and sent flowers, and above all, the artist boy gave me back to health. I rose from my sick bed renewed in faith in my own strength. Like Sasha, I now felt that I, too, could overcome every difficulty and face every test for my ideal. Had I not overcome the strongest and most primitive craving of a woman, the desire for a child? During those weeks, Fedya and I became lovers. It had grown clear to me that my feelings for Fedya had no bearing on my love for Sasha. Each called out different emotions of my being, took me into different worlds. They created no conflict. They only brought fulfillment. I told Sasha about my love for Fedya. His response was bigger and more beautiful than I had expected. I believe in your freedom to love, he said. He was aware of his possessive tendencies and hated them like everything else he had got from his bourgeois background. Perhaps if Fedya were not his friend, he might be jealous. He knew he had a large streak of jealousy in his makeup. But not only was Fedya his friend, he was his comrade in battle, and I was more to him than merely a woman. His love for me was intense, but the revolutionist and the fighter meant more to him. When our artist friend came home that day, the boys embraced. Late into the night, we talked for our plans for further activities. When we separated, we had made a pact to dedicate ourselves to the cause in some supreme deed, to die together if necessary, or to continue to live and work for the ideal for which one of us might have to give his life. The days and weeks that followed were illuminated by the glorious new light in us. We became more patient with each other, more understanding.